The spark of suspicion. How witch hunts began in medieval Europe. Close your eyes and picture a quiet medieval village. The morning mist clings to thatched rooftops. A rooster crows in the distance, and barefoot children chase chickens through the mud. Life seems simple, even peaceful, at least on the surface. But beneath that simplicity, there is a growing tension, an undercurrent of fear that seeps into the cracks of every wooden door, into every whispered conversation. Because in this world, misfortune doesn't come from bad luck or natural causes. It comes from someone. Someone caused the sickness, the crop failure, the storm. And that someone might be your neighbor or your own grandmother. And the word for that kind of person is witch. But where did this fear begin? Witch hunts didn't just appear overnight. The roots go deep, tangled in folklore, theology, politics, and fear of the unknown. Long before the infamous trials of the 15th to 17th centuries, medieval Europe was already obsessed with the idea that some people had secret, dangerous powers. In early Christian Europe, the official stance of the church was actually that witches weren't real. Belief in witchcraft was considered superstition, pagan nonsense that true Christians should reject. But that changed over time, drastically. The first shift began with theological anxiety. As the church expanded its power, it needed to control not only behavior, but belief. Anything that fell outside official doctrine, divination, herbal medicine, local healing practices, was seen as a threat. And women, especially older women, often served as healers and midwives in their communities. They knew which herbs soothed fevers, which teas calmed nerves, which rituals helped deliver babies safely. That made them valuable. But it also made them dangerous. Because if you can heal, maybe you can also harm. The idea of maleficium took root, magic done with the intent to cause harm. Maleficium wasn't about broomsticks or black cats. It was about the belief that someone could curse your livestock, blight your fields, or cause your baby to die in the cradle, all through unseen, unnatural forces. And if such a power existed, the church argued it must come from Satan himself. This is where things turned dark. By the 13th century, inquisitors were already combing the countryside, rooting out heretics. But soon, heresy and witchcraft became entangled. If you believed something unorthodox, say that the moon influenced fertility or that spirits lived in the forest, you weren't just wrong, you were suspect. And if something bad happened in your village, if someone got sick or a fire broke out or the weather turned against you, it didn't take long before fingers started pointing. Let's imagine you're living in one of these villages. It's been a hard year. The harvest was poor. Your neighbor's child died suddenly. And last night, you heard a strange noise near your barn. You don't want to believe it, but people are talking. About the old widow on the edge of town. She lives alone. She never goes to church. And last spring, your cow gave birth to a deformed calf right after she looked at it. Suddenly, the dots start to connect, even if they shouldn't. And it's not just you. The whole village feels uneasy. That's how fear spreads, not logically, but emotionally. One accusation becomes two become five. The tension builds until the local priest or magistrate steps in. And then the machinery of accusation begins. But why did these fears take hold so powerfully in Europe? Part of the answer lies in the world people lived in. Medieval life was full of danger. Illness, crop failure, famine, and death were constant threats. Science couldn't explain them. The church could, but often through spiritual terms. If you sinned, God might punish you. If someone else sinned, the community might suffer. So when something went wrong, people looked for someone to blame. Not something. Someone. In times of social stress, war, plague, economic hardship, accusations soared. During the Black Death, when entire towns were wiped out, communities searched desperately for a scapegoat. Jews, heretics, and witches all became targets. Anyone who was different, who didn't fit, who stood out, was at risk. Now imagine being a woman in this world. Maybe you're unmarried. Maybe you're poor. Maybe you speak your mind, or you live alone, or you know how to ease a fever with herbs. Any one of these traits might be enough to raise suspicion. All of them together, you're practically a suspect already. This wasn't just about superstition. It was about power. Witch hunts allowed communities to police their members, especially women. They reinforced conformity. They punished difference. And they gave frightened people someone to blame. Even worse, The legal system began to support this madness. In the 15th century, a Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer published a book that would become the witch hunter's Bible, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It argued that witches were real, dangerous, and almost always women. It described how to identify, interrogate, and punish them. It was widely read, reprinted, and used as justification for hundreds, then thousands of trials. Under this system, a simple accusation could ruin you. Torture was legal. Confessions were extracted through pain. And once one person confessed, they might name others, either to end their suffering or under pressure from authorities. Entire villages could be swept up in fear, whole families destroyed. And remember, there was no way to prove your innocence. If you denied being a witch, you were lying, because witches lie. If you cried, you were guilty, because witches are emotional. If you stayed calm, you were guilty, because witches are cold and cunning. Every action was twisted into a sign of guilt. There were water tests, where accused women were thrown into rivers to see if they floated. Floating meant you were a witch. Sinking meant innocence, but could also mean drowning. There were tests involving needles and pins, pricking the skin to find the witch's mark, an insensitive spot supposedly gifted by the devil. And if none of that worked, dreams, visions, or rumors were often enough. It was a terrifying, no-win scenario, and yet it continued, for decades, for centuries, fueled by fear, power, religion, and social control. So the next time you hear about a medieval village, don't imagine just cozy cottages and quaint markets. Remember the fear, the suspicion, the long shadow cast by the question no one dared say aloud: who among us is a witch? Section 2. A Powder Keg of Fear. How Panic Ignited Persecution. To truly understand how witch hunts erupted across medieval Europe, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The mood, the politics, the natural disasters, and the deeply human fears simmering beneath the surface. Because witch hunts didn't appear out of nowhere. They were born from centuries of religious tension, economic instability, unexplained illness, and the constant threat of death, all mixing into a volatile soup just waiting to boil over. Let's start with religion. By the time of the late Middle Ages, Christianity had become the dominant spiritual force across most of Europe. The church wasn't just a place to pray. It was the law, the government, the news, and the doctor's office all rolled into one. What the church said was truth, and questioning it could get you branded a heretic or worse. But even within Christianity, tensions were high. The Catholic Church held immense power, and any deviation from its teachings was seen as a threat to the entire social order. When plagues spread, when crops failed, when kings fell in battle, the question was always the same: why is this happening? And the answer was often, because God is angry. And if God was angry, someone had to be to blame. In this context, the concept of witches, people working in secret against God and using demonic powers to harm others, gained traction. These weren't the broomstick-riding, black cat-loving figures of Halloween costumes. In the medieval imagination, witches were people who had chosen to reject God in favor of the devil. That idea was terrifying. It meant the enemy wasn't out there in a battlefield or in another kingdom. The enemy was your neighbor. Then there was the plague. The Black Death hit Europe in the mid-1300s and killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became graveyards. People walked through streets filled with corpses and the smell of decay. Imagine the trauma of that, losing your parents, your children, your priest, your friends, often in the span of days. Medicine couldn't help. Prayers didn't stop it. People were desperate for answers. And in desperation, human beings looked for someone to blame. Jews were accused and massacred. Lepers were burned alive. And increasingly, attention turns who acted a little different. The midwife who knew too much about herbs, the widow who kept to herself, the woman whose baby died mysteriously. If something tragic happened and couldn't be explained, rumors started. She gave the evil eye, people would whisper. She cursed that child. She made a pact with the devil. And once the idea took root, it spread. Part of what made witch hunts so powerful was that they often started small. A child fell ill, a cow stopped giving milk, someone had a bad dream, but quickly escalated. All it took was a single accusation. And from there, the community would descend into suspicion and fear. Neighbors turned against each other. Families were torn apart. No one was safe. Adding fuel to the fire were the political changes of the time. As kingdoms and cities grew in size and power, leaders sought more control over their populations. Accusations of witchcraft became convenient tools. If a town was rebellious, a few arrests could instill fear. If a nobleman needed land, accusing someone of sorcery could justify confiscating property. Some rulers even encouraged witch trials to demonstrate their own piety and moral authority. And the church, for a long time, went along with it. In fact, in 1486, two German inquisitors named Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published a book called Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. It became one of the most influential manuals on identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. The book claimed that witches were overwhelmingly women, that they made pacts with Satan, and that they could harm crops, cause illness, control weather, and seduce men. It also detailed the steps to prosecute them, many of which involved brutal torture. The Hammer of Witches was not an official church document, but it gained widespread popularity. In the climate of the time, full of fear, superstition, and religious zeal, it was like tossing a match into dry straw. It's important to understand that belief in magic wasn't new. In ancient times, people practiced folk remedies, consulted astrologers, and believed in spirits. But in medieval Europe, those practices were slowly rebranded as heretical, even satanic. What once had been tolerated, even seen as helpful, was now considered treason against God. And once someone was accused of witchcraft, escape was nearly impossible. Trials weren't fair by modern standards. Accused witches were denied legal representation. Evidence was often little more than gossip. Confessions were extracted under torture, and once someone confessed, they were usually executed anyway. Worse still, accused witches were sometimes forced to name others, a cruel tactic that ensured the witch hunts kept growing. Interrogations involved sleep deprivation, starvation, and physical abuse. Women were stripped naked in search for witches' marks, any mole, scar, or birthmark that could be twisted into evidence. Ironically, if someone didn't confess under torture, they were considered especially dangerous because the devil must be helping them resist. Can you imagine that? Being dragged from your home, tied to a chair, beaten, and told that unless you admit to impossible crimes, the suffering won't stop. And even if you confess, they'll still kill you. The fear was so deep, so pervasive, that even the innocent sometimes began to believe they were guilty. There are records of people, under intense pressure, admitting to flying through the air, turning into animals, or dancing with demons in the forest. The human mind can break under that kind of duress. Witch hunts weren't limited to a single country. They spread across Germany, France, England, Scotland, Switzerland, the Low Countries, and beyond. Some of the most brutal took place in German-speaking regions, where towns might execute dozens or even hundreds of people over a few years. In Salem, Massachusetts, though much later, the witch trials of 1692 followed many of the same patterns. Fear, rumor, accusations, and innocent lives destroyed. At its core, the witch hunt phenomenon wasn't just about superstition. It was about fear, power, and control. It allowed societies to project their anxieties onto individuals, usually women, and destroy them in the name of righteousness. But these tragedies also reveal something deep about the human condition. Our need to explain the unexplainable, to assign blame, and to feel in control, even when the world around us is anything but. And so across fields and forests, in towns big and small, the fires burned. In the next section, we'll follow the story of one such village and see how one accusation spiraled into a catastrophe that no one could stop. Section 3, the spark that lit the fire, the role of fear, superstition, and social upheaval. Fear is a powerful tool, and in medieval Europe, it was everywhere. Fear of the unknown, fear of disease, fear of the devil, fear of your neighbor. When we look at the witch hunts of the era, we must understand that they didn't arise from nothing. They were cultivated in soil rich with fear, superstition, and social instability. To begin with, let's talk about religion. By the late Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had become the dominant authority in Europe, not just spiritually, but culturally, politically, and socially. Anything that challenged its authority, even if unintentionally, was viewed as a threat not just to the institution, but to the divine order itself. The church preached that the devil was real and always working to corrupt the faithful. Witches, then, were not simply odd women mixing herbs in the woods. They were, in the eyes of the church, willing agents of Satan. But religion alone doesn't explain everything. The witch hunts didn't reach their peak until the 15th to 17th centuries. Why then? Why not during earlier plagues or famines? The answer lies in what was happening around that time. A perfect storm of social upheaval, climate disaster, and institutional anxiety. The period known as the Little Ice Age had begun. Winters were colder, harvests were failing, and starvation was not uncommon. Crops rotted in the field. Livestock died from disease. People needed someone to blame. And when people are desperate, they look for scapegoats. It's easier to say that your cow died because the widow down the road cursed it than to accept the randomness of nature. Superstition became a coping mechanism, a way to regain control in a chaotic world. At the same time, Europe was changing rapidly. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the religious landscape, and both Catholic and Protestant factions accused each other of heresy, devil worship, and corruption. This atmosphere of mutual suspicion trickled down into everyday life. If religious leaders could accuse one another of being in league with the devil, why couldn't villagers accuse the midwife or the lonely spinster? Moreover, many women were starting to occupy roles that gave them a kind of unofficial power. Herbalists, healers, and midwives. These women had knowledge that others didn't. They knew how to help a woman give birth, how to ease pain, how to treat wounds. But their knowledge, rooted in folk tradition and empirical experience rather than church doctrine, made them both valuable and dangerous. They were respected in times of need, but mistrusted when things went wrong. It didn't help that medieval and early modern medicine was rudimentary at best. The boundary between illness and magic was porous. If a child was born deformed or if someone had seizures, it might be seen as a curse. And if someone got better after a healing ritual, the healer might be suspected of using magic. Either way, suspicion grew. Social structure also played a role. Many accused witches were older women, often widows, living alone. These women were vulnerable. They had no husband to defend them, no sons to fight for their honor. In a society where a woman's value was often tied to her relationship with a man, a woman without male protection was an anomaly, an unsettling figure. Her independence was threatening. Her survival outside the norm made people nervous. She was easy to target. Sometimes accusations were a matter of convenience. A neighbor wanted your land. Someone owed you money. You turned down a marriage proposal. Suddenly, someone has a dream that you flew through their window at night or cursed their bread. The legal process, if it can be called that, often accepted such spectral evidence as proof. Dreams, visions, even a gut feeling could land you in a courtroom or worse, on a pyre. The printing press, a revolutionary invention, also played an ironic role in amplifying fear. Books like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, spread the idea that witches were everywhere and must be eradicated. The book was essentially a manual on how to identify, try, and punish witches. It was misogynistic, deeply paranoid, and wildly popular. For many inquisitors, it became a kind of Bible for witch hunting. The law was not your friend either. Accused witches were often presumed guilty. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, and people will say anything to make the pain stop. Under duress, accused individuals would often name others, creating a ripple effect. One accusation could spiral into dozens. Families were torn apart. Communities were ripped open. And once someone was accused, their chances of acquittal were slim. It's important to remember that many of these trials were not conducted by some distant authority, but by your neighbors. The same people who sat beside you in church, who traded with you in the market, who watched your children play with theirs. Fear doesn't just come from above, it rises from within. It's contagious. In this climate, justice became a farce. Trials lacked due process. Evidence was often non-existent or absurd. If you sank in water, you were innocent but dead. If you floated, you were guilty and burned. If you had a mole or a birthmark, it could be called a witch's teat, a spot where your familiar and animal spirit supposedly drank your blood. These weren't metaphors. People truly believed them. Men were accused too, though far less often. When they were, it was usually because they were connected to accused women or were themselves poor and isolated. But the vast majority of those persecuted were women, especially older, impoverished, unmarried, or childless ones. In some regions, entire villages were left without women after a wave of executions. This wasn't just a tragedy of individuals, it was a societal collapse of compassion. It showed how fear can erode empathy, how institutions meant to protect can become tools of terror, and how ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary cruelty when they are frightened and desperate. Witch hunts were not just about witches. They were about control over women, over knowledge, over uncertainty. They were a way for society to police its boundaries, to enforce conformity, to punish difference. And in doing so, they left a legacy of pain that echoes even into our modern times. Section 4. Trials of Terror, Inside the Courtrooms of the Damned. If you were accused of witchcraft in medieval Europe, your nightmare was only beginning. The terror didn't end with the accusation. It only deepened inside the courtroom, where the rules of fairness, logic, and mercy were suspended in favor of fear and control. The legal system in a witch trial was not built to prove innocence. It was built to confirm guilt. Let's start with how you got to court in the first place. You weren't read your rights. You weren't guaranteed a defense. Often, you wouldn't even know why you had been accused. Someone might have whispered about you after a bad harvest. A neighbor's baby might have died suddenly. Or maybe someone simply envied your small patch of land. Whatever the reason, you could be dragged from your home in the middle of the night, tied up, and thrown into a filthy cell with no food, light, or fresh air. Once there, the trial began. Not in the way we think of trials today, with juries, evidence, and presumption of innocence. No. In witch trials, the process was entirely stacked against you. Accusers didn't need to prove anything beyond a personal testimony. Hearsay and dreams were accepted as facts. A midwife could be accused because she assisted in a birth where the baby was deformed. A healer might be blamed for a potion that didn't work. An elderly woman who muttered to herself could be seen as casting spells. And worse, if you dared to defend yourself, that in itself was suspicious. After all, how could you be so calm and articulate if you weren't under the devil's protection? If you protested your innocence too loudly, you were trying to deceive the court. If you wept, you were pretending to show remorse. If you were silent, it was proof of guilt. It was a trap, and every path led to the same end. Then came the tortures. Torture was legal. Not only legal, but actively encouraged as a method to purify the soul through confession. Ironically, these confessions were treated as freely given, even though they were extracted through unspeakable pain. Your hands might be crushed. You might be hung from the ceiling by your arms until your shoulders dislocated. Some were subjected to sleep deprivation for days, others beaten with rods, burned, or placed on the rack, where limbs were stretched until bones snapped. But the worst part? They'd stop just long enough to ask you names. Who else is in your coven? Who did you meet in the forest? What demon did you speak to? And you would say anything. You'd name your friends, your family, anyone just to make it stop. And those people would then be arrested, and the cycle would continue. One confession could doom an entire village. Of course, there were other tests too, infamous ones. There was the water test, sometimes called swimming a witch. The accused was bound hand and foot and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the pure water. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. A lose-lose situation. There was the pricking test. An investigator would poke your skin with long pins or needles, searching for the witch's mark, a numb spot that didn't bleed. Any birthmark, mole, scar, or freckle could qualify. If you winced or bled, that was bad. If you didn't, that was worse. And then there was spectral evidence, where people claimed you appeared in their dreams or attacked them in spirit. You didn't even need to be present. If someone said they saw you in a vision, that could be enough for the court to convict you. You might think your faith could save you. After all, you prayed, you attended mass. But religion was no shield. Once accused, your every action was reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. Your piety could be seen as a cover. Your fasting could be witchcraft. Your dreams could be demonic. Even the misfortune of others could be twisted into evidence of your malice. The judges were often clergy or local officials, not trained lawyers. They viewed their role not as dispensers of justice, but as guardians of moral order. Convicting a witch was seen as protecting the community from Satan's corruption. Mercy in this context was weakness. Harshness was holiness, and there was no appeal. If you confessed, you might be executed quickly, hung or burned at the stake. If you refused, the torture would continue until you did. And even if by some miracle you were acquitted, your life was effectively over. You would return to your village marked as a witch. No one would trade with you. No one would speak to you. You'd be shunned, hated, and possibly attacked. And it's important to note, this wasn't just happening in backwater hamlets. Entire governments endorsed and orchestrated these trials. In Germany, France, Scotland, and Switzerland, courts held massive witch trials that consumed dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives. In Würzburg and Bamberg alone, in the 1620s, over 1,000 people were executed, many of them children. Why children? Because under torture, accused witches claimed to have recruited their own sons or daughters, or neighbors' kids, and those children were then questioned, coerced, and eventually condemned. No one was safe. What's perhaps most haunting is the finality of it all. There were no second chances, no room for doubt. Once labeled a witch, you were treated as an infection, something to be removed before it spread. And your neighbors, the people you grew up with, were often the ones cheering your execution, relieved that you, not they, were chosen. The witch trials were not just episodes of mass paranoia. They were systemic failures of justice, morality, and reason. They show us how fear, once institutionalized, can rot every part of society, how power, when unchecked, can become cruelty, and how people, desperate for certainty in uncertain times, can turn against one another with terrifying speed. So if you were a healer or an herbalist, or simply a woman living alone in medieval Europe, the truth is chilling. You didn't need to be a witch to be executed as one. You only needed to be vulnerable. Section 5. The Fires of Punishment, Execution and the Spectacle of Fear. By the time your trial ended, if it could even be called that, you weren't just emotionally and physically broken. You were condemned. The court had reached its decision long before you walked into that dark room, and now your fate was sealed. But the end wasn't quiet. It wasn't merciful. It was public, brutal, and carefully orchestrated to send a message to everyone watching. This is what happens to witches. In medieval Europe, the execution of an accused witch was not a hidden act. It was a spectacle, a warning, a show designed to terrify and to reinforce the authority of the church and the ruling powers. Crowds would gather in the village square or outside city walls, children perched on shoulders, merchants selling bread and hot drinks. For many, it was entertainment. For others, reassurance that their fears had been answered by fire. The method of execution depended on where you lived and what you were accused of. In some regions, especially parts of England and the Low Countries, hanging was the norm. It was quick, comparatively speaking, though not painless. You might be forced to climb a ladder with a noose around your neck, pushed off to dangle and choke as the crowd looked on. If the executioner was skilled, your neck might break. If not, you'd strangle for minutes while your legs kicked in the air. But in many other places, particularly in continental Europe, burning was preferred. Burning at the stake, it was slow, excruciating, and symbolic. Fire, after all, was seen as purifying. It destroyed the flesh while cleansing the soul, or so the authorities claimed. You would be marched to the stake, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in a rough shift or nothing at all. You might be gagged if you screamed too loudly or prayed in the wrong way. Then you'd be tied to a thick wooden pole, kindly piled around your feet, often soaked in oil or pitch. Sometimes the fire was lit right away. Other times it was delayed, perhaps for a final confession or to let the gathered crowd savor the drama. In rare cases, if you had powerful friends or a sympathetic priest, you might be strangled before the fire was lit. That was considered an act of mercy. But mercy was rare. Once the flames rose, the pain was beyond imagination. Your skin would blister, blacken, and peel. You'd scream until your lungs burned. If the fire was poorly built, it might smolder rather than roar, meaning you'd cook slowly, piece by piece. Your family, if present, would be forced to watch. And when it was over, your ashes would be scattered or buried in unconsecrated ground. You would not be remembered with honor. You would not be mourned. What made this horror even worse was how public it all was. Posters might be nailed to trees or tavern doors announcing the date of your burning. Local lords and church officials would attend, not just as witnesses, but as participants, delivering final sermons, reading aloud your list of crimes, justifying the judgment to the crowd. Sometimes multiple victims were burned at once. Families were destroyed together. Mothers and daughters, husbands and wives, tied to stakes side by side. And these executions weren't just punishments, they were lessons. Each burning told the villagers, obey, stay silent, conform. If someone questioned the trials, they might be next. If someone cried too loudly at your death, they could be accused of sympathy with the devil. This fear spread like disease. People turned on each other. Neighbors watched neighbors. Husbands denounced wives. Children testified against parents. In this atmosphere, trust evaporated. Kindness disappeared. And all of it, every hanging, every burning, every whispered accusation, was done in the name of righteousness. Over time, the sheer scale of the witch hunts became unbearable. Some communities lost dozens of people. Entire villages were depopulated. And as more and more were killed, some began to question, were all these people really witches? It was a dangerous question. Those who asked it too loudly were silenced. But quietly, in the shadows, doubt began to spread. Some priests, especially those who witnessed the trials firsthand, became uneasy. Some judges retired with guilt, and a few brave voices began to speak out. But it would take centuries before real change happened, before laws were rewritten, before torture was banned, before confessions under duress were deemed invalid, before the belief in witches as a legal category was erased. Until then, the fires continued to burn. It's estimated that tens of thousands, perhaps more than 60,000 people, were executed across Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries. Most of them were women. Most were innocent. And their deaths, inflicted by neighbors, courts, and clergy, were justified by fear and superstition. To understand witch hunts is to understand how power operates when it is unchecked, how fear can justify cruelty, and how entire societies can become complicit in evil when they believe they are doing what is right. Because the real horror of the witch trials wasn't magic, it was us. Section 6. The role of gender. Why women were the primary victims. To understand why the vast majority of witch trial victims were women, you have to look beyond the surface accusations of casting spells or consorting with the devil. The true reasons are tangled deep within the social, religious, and political structures of medieval Europe. At its core, the witch hunt phenomenon was about fear, but not just of witches. It was about fear of women, power, and anything that disrupted the patriarchal status quo. Let's start with the numbers. Historians estimate that around 75 to 85% of those accused of witchcraft during the peak of the European witch hunts were women. In some regions, it was nearly 100%. This wasn't a coincidence. Women were believed to be more susceptible to the devil's temptations, the weaker vessel, as the church often described them. Religious texts and sermons preached that Eve had brought sin into the world, and her daughters were just as dangerous. But it wasn't just theology. Social roles played a huge part. Most women in medieval and early modern Europe lived rigidly confined lives. They were expected to be obedient wives, fertile mothers, and devout Christians. Their work, midwifery, herbalism, weaving, caregiving, was often undervalued or dismissed as domestic labor, even when it was essential to the survival of the community. But when things went wrong, when crops failed, when children died, when livestock grew sick, suddenly that same woman who knew too much about plants or childbirth was suspicious. Midwives especially were prime targets. These women had knowledge of the female body, of pain management, of life and death. They delivered babies and sometimes ended pregnancies. They were both respected and feared. And when things went wrong during childbirth, which they often did, the community needed someone to blame. Likewise, older women who lived alone, especially widows, were seen as deeply suspicious. Without a husband to control them, they were independent, an unsettling idea in a society that prized male authority. If an elderly woman was poor, cantankerous, or simply odd, she might be branded a witch just for asking for food or medicine. If she was denied and cursed her neighbor out of frustration, and something bad happened soon after, a cow died, a child got sick, it was enough to start the rumors. There was also a disturbing sexual undertone to many witch accusations. Interrogations often focused on the accused woman's body, asking invasive and humiliating questions. Did she have a devil's mark? Had she lain with the devil? What did it feel like? How did he appear to her? These questions weren't just about theology. They were about control, domination, and shame. Many confessions were extracted under torture, where women were stripped, prodded, and forced to say things their male interrogators wanted to hear. In some cases, a woman's only crime was being too beautiful or too ugly. If a woman was attractive and unmarried, she was considered a temptress. If she rejected a man's advances, and that man held power, he might accuse her of bewitching him. On the other hand, if she was elderly or disfigured, she was seen as unnatural, threatening, unclean. Either way, she couldn't win. Worse still, women who spoke out against injustice, against authority, even just too loudly in public, were at higher risk. The witch trials were not just about rooting out heresy. They were about silencing women, and the fear of witches was weaponized as a tool of social control. But this wasn't only a man versus woman dynamic. The tragedy of the witch hunts is that women also accused other women. Sometimes it was done out of fear. If you didn't point the finger might turn on you. Sometimes it was driven by jealousy, feuds, or survival. In tight-knit communities where lives were intertwined and tensions ran high, old grudges could become fatal. A whispered insult or a decades-old dispute could explode into full-blown accusations, leading to torture, trial, and death. These dynamics played out repeatedly across Europe. In Germany, the heartland of the witch craze, entire female lineages were destroyed. In Scotland, women were dragged from their homes at night and kept in witch prisons awaiting torture. In France, mothers and daughters were executed together. In England, the so-called witch finders went from town to town stirring up fear, often for profit, dragging women into courtrooms on flimsy evidence or no evidence at all. And all of this was justified by deeply entrenched beliefs about women's moral inferiority. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, fueled this fire. The book argued that women were more likely to become witches because they were more impressionable, more carnal, and less capable of rational thought. It instructed magistrates and priests to focus on women in their witch hunts and laid out brutal methods for extracting confessions. It became one of the most influential texts of the period and remained in use for over a century. The impact was catastrophic. The witch hunts didn't just kill tens of thousands of women, they entrenched misogyny into the legal and spiritual framework of Europe. They created a cultural legacy where women were associated with chaos, temptation, and evil. Even after the trials died down, the scars remained. In stories, in laws, in the way women's behavior was policed and scrutinized. Today, we remember the witch trials not only as a tragic chapter in history, but as a warning. They show how fear and power can combine to create cruelty, how societies can turn on their most vulnerable, and how gender can be used as both a weapon and a target. Because in the end, the truth about the witch hunts is this: it wasn't about witches, it was about control. Section 7. Tools of Torture, How Confessions Were Made. If you think witch trials were about discovering the truth, think again. They were about producing confessions, no matter what it took. The goal wasn't justice, it was fear, control, and spectacle. And at the heart of this brutal process was torture, systematic, state-sanctioned, and horrifyingly creative. To truly understand the terror of being accused of witchcraft in medieval Europe, you need to look inside the chamber where innocence ended and agony began. Once someone was accused of being a witch, the path was set. Even if there was no real evidence, just gossip, suspicion, or a child's nightmare, authorities would take action. The mere accusation was enough to strip a person of rights. Guilt was assumed. The only thing left was to extract the confession, and torture was the tool of choice. Let's start with sleep deprivation, one of the most common techniques. Accused witches were often kept awake for days on end, interrogated over and over while shackled or bound. Guards might shake them violently every time they began to nod off. This wasn't just to wear them down physically, It was psychological warfare. Over time, reality blurred. Victims became delirious. They would say anything to make it stop. Then came the strappado. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted by a rope attached to the wrists. Then they were dropped, just enough to dislocate the shoulders. This could be done repeatedly, each time more painful. Bones cracked, ligaments tore, nerves were damaged permanently. Yet still, no blood was spilled, so the torturers claimed it wasn't cruel. Other times, the accused were subjected to the rack, a wooden frame that slowly stretched the body by cranking arms and legs in opposite directions. This tore muscles, snapped joints, and sometimes caused death by internal bleeding. It was slow, excruciating, and impossible to resist. No one came out of it whole. For women especially, witch prickers used sharp needles to stab the skin in search of the infamous devil's mark. This mark, supposedly a spot on the body where the devil had kissed or branded his follower, was believed to be numb and would not bleed. In truth, it was often a mole, scar, or birthmark. Witch prickers jabbed women's bodies, sometimes hundreds of times, until they found a spot that didn't cause a reaction. Then, the verdict was clear: guilty. Another infamous method was thumb screws, in which metal clamps were tightened around the fingers or toes until the bones cracked. Some had screws for the knees, elbows, or even heads. There was also crushing, where stones were piled on the chest until the ribs collapsed. And the iron chair, heated until glowing red, then used as a seat of judgment. In some places, accused witches were forced to endure the ordeal by water. Bound hand and foot, they were tossed into a river or lake. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. If they floated, it was proof they were in league with the devil, who was repelling the holy water. Either way, it was a death sentence. Torture chambers were often public or semi-public spectacles. Local townsfolk might hear the screams from inside. Some were invited to witness, reinforcing the lesson. This is what happens when you step outside the line. Torturers were usually not executioners, but magistrates, priests, or appointed experts. And the church, though it often banned bloodshed, it permitted these methods because pain without blood was seen as legal. The confessions obtained were often incoherent or fantastical. People admitted to flying on broomsticks, transforming into animals, or meeting Satan in the forest. Many named others, neighbors, family, friends, as fellow witches. Sometimes they did it willingly, out of madness. Other times, names were forced from them. One confession became 20. Entire communities could unravel from a single scream. Even children weren't safe. In many witch hunts, including infamous cases in Würzburg and Salem, children were both accusers and accused. Some were tortured. Others witnessed their mothers burned or hanged. In certain twisted cases, confessions were extracted from children as young as 7, who were then executed. But why was confession so important? Because it gave the system legitimacy. If someone confessed, it was seen as proof that the authorities were right, that witches were real, and the punishment was deserved. The public could sleep easier knowing evil had been identified and destroyed. And even if the accused died under torture, as they often did, the record showed they had admitted guilt. The cycle continued, and the fear grew stronger. What's most terrifying is how normalized this became. Torture was legal. It was taught. Manuals detailed how to apply it effectively. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, issued in 1532, laid out the rules: how long you could torture someone, how to record a confession, how to handle recantations. It was methodical, bureaucratic, industrialized cruelty. Today we look back in horror. We cannot imagine a world where pain is truth and silence is guilt. But for hundreds of years in medieval Europe, this was reality. If you were accused of witchcraft, you had no voice, no defense, no chance. And if you were tortured, it wasn't because you were guilty. It was because you were vulnerable, poor, female, strange, alone, and the people in power needed someone to blame. Section 8. Mass hysteria, when communities turned against themselves. Imagine waking up one morning in your quiet village and discovering that 3 women from your street have been accused of witchcraft. You've shared meals with them, helped them draw water, watched their children grow. Now they're being dragged away, and people whisper that they consorted with the devil. The ground shifts beneath you, and suddenly, no one feels safe. Because witch hunts in medieval Europe weren't just about individuals, they were about entire communities unraveling into fear, suspicion, and collective madness. Mass hysteria wasn't a side effect of witch hunts. It was the engine that powered them. Once an accusation was made and taken seriously by local authorities or clergy, fear spread rapidly. The notion of a witch within the village turned every small misfortune into a potential sign of evil. A cow dying in the night, a storm destroying the harvest, a child falling ill. Any of these could be blamed not on chance or nature, but on the hidden hand of a neighbor working black magic. And once that mindset took hold, it fed on itself like fire in dry brush. The social mechanisms that usually held communities together, shared work, religion, kinship, began to break down. People turned on one another to protect themselves. Children accused parents, wives accused husbands, servants accused employers. Entire families were swept up in the panic, sometimes executed together. In many cases, fear of not accusing became just as powerful as the fear of witches themselves. If someone around you was arrested and you didn't know anything, it might look suspicious. People began to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, just to end the questioning. Worse, they offered up others' names, hoping it would save them. It rarely did. The very structure of trials reinforced the hysteria. Once one person was found guilty, authorities expected accomplices. Interrogators pressured confessions until a web of witches seemed to be uncovered. But the web wasn't real. It was built from pain, fear, and imagination. One of the most disturbing examples of mass hysteria occurred in Würzburg, Germany. Between 1626 and 1631, over 900 people were executed for witchcraft, including children, priests, and even noblemen. The panic began with a few accusations and exploded into a full-blown purge. People reported seeing witches' Sabbaths, ghosts, demonic animals. There was no evidence, just fear, dreams, and secondhand stories. Even more chilling is the realization that these communities believed they were doing the right thing. People thought they were saving their souls, their families, their crops. That by rooting out evil, they were protecting the world from damnation. They went to church after sending neighbors to the stake. They prayed while screams echoed through the town square. And then, just as suddenly, it would stop. A new bishop might arrive, or a war might shift priorities. People would look around and wonder what they had done. But by then, it was too late. Entire lineages were gone, villages were left scarred, and no one ever truly felt safe again. How did this happen? The answer lies in a mix of social stress, religious fervor, and lack of knowledge. Medieval Europe was a world of uncertainty. Plagues wiped out entire towns. Crops failed without warning. Wars were constant. In that chaos, people craved order and scapegoats. The church, with its emphasis on sin, hell, and spiritual warfare, provided a framework for understanding suffering. If something went wrong, it had to be someone's fault. The idea of a cosmic battle between good and evil made it easy to place blame, and witches fit the role perfectly. They were outsiders, poor, strange. They talked to animals, used herbs, lived alone, or sometimes they were just women who spoke too boldly or didn't marry. That was enough. The psychological toll on those not accused was profound. People lived in constant fear, not just of the supernatural, but of each other. Paranoia became normal. Trust dissolved. Even those who never faced trial carried the trauma of watching friends die, of keeping silent, of surviving when others didn't. And perhaps worst of all was what it taught children. Many grew up believing that the world was full of hidden enemies, that people could look normal but be secretly evil, that justice meant pain, that truth could be tortured out of someone, that silence was survival. These lessons didn't fade quickly. They echoed across generations, like long after the fires were put out. Mass hysteria is not a relic of the past. It's a human reaction to fear and powerlessness. And in medieval Europe, witch hunts were one of its most deadly expressions. What makes it especially tragic is how ordinary people, farmers, bakers, mothers, became instruments of terror, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Section 8. Mass hysteria, when communities turned against themselves. Imagine waking up one morning in your quiet village and discovering that 3 women from your street have been accused of witchcraft. You've shared meals with them, helped them draw water, watched their children grow. Now they're being dragged away, and people whisper that they consorted with the devil. The ground shifts beneath you, and suddenly no one feels safe. Because witch hunts in medieval Europe weren't just about individuals, they were about entire communities unraveling into fear, suspicion, and collective madness. Mass hysteria wasn't a side effect of witch hunts. It was the engine that powered them. Once an accusation was made and taken seriously by local authorities or clergy, fear spread rapidly. The notion of a witch within the village turned every small misfortune into a potential sign of evil. A cow dying in the night, a storm destroying the harvest, a child falling ill. Any of these could be blamed not on chance or nature, but on the hidden hand of a neighbor working black magic. And once that mindset took hold, it fed on itself like fire in dry brush. The social mechanisms that usually held communities together, shared work, religion, kinship, began to break down. People turned on one another to protect themselves. Children accused parents, wives accused husbands, servants accused employers. Entire families were swept up in the panic, sometimes executed together. In many cases, fear of not accusing became just as powerful as the fear of witches themselves. If someone around you was arrested and you didn't know anything, it might look suspicious. People began to confess to crimes they hadn't committed just to end the questioning. Worse, they offered up others' names, hoping it would save them. It rarely did. The very structure of trials reinforced the hysteria. Once one person was found guilty, authorities expected accomplices. Interrogators pressured confessions until a web of witches seemed to be uncovered. But the web wasn't real. It was built from pain, fear, and imagination. One of the most disturbing examples of mass hysteria occurred in Würzburg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631. Over 900 people were executed for witchcraft, including children, priests, and even noblemen. The panic began with a few accusations and exploded into a full-blown purge. People reported seeing witches' Sabbaths, ghosts, demonic animals. There was no evidence, just fear, dreams, and secondhand stories. Even more chilling is the realization that these communities believed they were doing the right thing. People thought they were saving their souls, their families, their crops. That by rooting out evil, they were protecting the world from damnation. They went to church after sending neighbors to the stake. They prayed while screams echoed through the town square. And then, just as suddenly, it would stop. A new bishop might arrive, or a war might shift priorities. People would look around and wonder what they had done. But by then, it was too late. Entire lineages were gone. Villages were left scarred. And no one ever truly felt safe again. How did this happen? The answer lies in a mix of social stress, religious fervor, and lack of knowledge. Medieval Europe was a world of uncertainty. Plagues wiped out entire towns. Crops failed without warning. Wars were constant. In that chaos, people craved order and scapegoats. The church, with its emphasis on sin, hell, and spiritual warfare, provided a framework for understanding suffering. If something went wrong, it had to be someone's fault. The idea of a cosmic battle between good and evil made it easy to place blame, and witches fit the role perfectly. They were outsiders, poor, strange. They talked to animals, used herbs, lived alone. Or sometimes they were just women who spoke too boldly or didn't marry. That was enough. The psychological toll on those not accused was profound. People lived in constant fear, not just of the supernatural, but of each other. Paranoia became normal. Trust dissolved. Even those who never faced trial carried the trauma of watching friends die, of keeping silent, of surviving when others didn't. And perhaps worst of all was what it taught children. Many grew up believing that the world was full of hidden enemies, that people could look normal but be secretly evil, that justice meant pain, that truth could be tortured out of someone, that silence was survival. These lessons didn't fade quickly. They echoed across generations, long after the fires were put out. Mass hysteria is not a relic of the past. It's a human reaction to fear and powerlessness. And in medieval Europe, witch hunts were one of its most deadly expressions. What makes it especially tragic is how ordinary people, farmers, bakers, mothers, became instruments of terror. Not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Section 9. Section 9. The role of fear, folklore, and the supernatural. To truly understand the psychological grip of the witch hunts, you must place yourself inside the medieval and early modern worldview. one that was not only shaped by religion and politics, but by a deep, inherited belief in the supernatural. The average villager in 15th or 16th century Europe lived in a world that teemed with unseen forces, some benevolent, but many malevolent. Devils, demons, spirits, ghosts, and witches were not metaphors or fairy tales. They were real, invisible actors who interfered in daily life, manipulating weather, livestock, illness, and even your dreams. Let's start with storms. When a hailstorm destroyed crops or a drought withered the fields, the explanation wasn't atmospheric pressure, it was maleficium. Someone had cursed the land. If a healthy child suddenly sickened and died, it wasn't bacteria, it was the evil eye. If your cow gave birth to a stillborn calf, you might find wax figures or toad bones buried under your barn. You didn't need science, you needed someone to blame. This is the soil in which witchcraft accusations thrived. It was fertile, emotional, and drenched in fear. Folklore taught that witches rode through the skies at night, that they communed with devils, gathered under full moons, danced naked in forests, and used body parts for potions. Some villagers even claimed to have seen these gatherings, wild Sabbaths of orgiastic ritual and blood sacrifice. The stories were vivid, terrifying, and strangely uniform across Europe. How? Much of it came from confessions. But remember, most of these confessions were extracted under torture. If someone is being stretched on the rack or has their fingernails torn out, they will say anything. And if you've read or heard the same legends your entire life, you'll draw from that shared vocabulary. You'll say you saw the devil in goat form, that you used a powder made from baby bones, that you flew on a broom. Not because you actually did, but because it's what your interrogators want to hear. Ironically, the fear of witches was often heightened by the very attempts to stamp it out. The more public the executions, the more frightened people became. After all, if the authorities were burning people alive, then witchcraft must be a real and imminent threat, right? It became a vicious cycle. Panic fed accusations, which fed executions, which fed more panic. In some communities, entire families were accused. A mother might be tried, then her daughter, then her neighbor. You might be questioned simply because you were friends with someone already under suspicion. People turned on each other to protect themselves. Children accused their parents. Husbands betrayed wives. And all the while, the fear of supernatural retaliation hung heavy in the air. What if the witch's curse hadn't ended with her death? And yet there were also practical reasons why these beliefs held sway. Witchcraft offered an explanation for suffering in a time when so much was mysterious and uncontrollable. It provided a sense of agency in a world dominated by disease, war, and famine. If someone was responsible for your misery, then maybe that misery could be stopped or avenged. Superstition also played out in rituals. Protective charms were buried under doorsteps. Horseshoes were nailed above barns. People wore amulets, drank concoctions of herbs, and whispered prayers against spells. The line between folk healing and witchcraft was razor thin, and that meant that anyone could slip from one side of it to the other, with or without warning. There was also something else simmering beneath the surface, the fear of women's power. The image of the witch was almost always female. Older women who lived alone, who were widowed, childless, or simply outspoken, were frequent targets. Their very independence was unsettling. They did not fit neatly into the social hierarchy, and so people assumed they must have gotten their status through unnatural means. This fear of the feminine took on bizarre and disturbing forms. Women were accused of stealing men's virility, of causing impotence, of seducing priests and kings through sorcery. The witch was not just dangerous, she was alluring, erotic, and transgressive. Her sexuality became a weapon, and this in turn justified horrific punishments. Bodies were not just burned, they were stripped, prodded, violated. The trials became a theater of control, with women's bodies as the stage. As you listen to all this, you might be tempted to think it's all in the distant past. That the fear, the hysteria, the mob violence, these are medieval relics. But history is rarely so neat. The patterns of persecution, scapegoating, demonizing the other, using fear to justify cruelty have echoed in many times and places. The witch hunts were fueled by more than superstition. They were fueled by a need to control, to punish, and to explain the inexplicable. So as we move forward in this story, remember, The belief in witches was not just about magic. It was about power. Who had it, who feared it, and what they were willing to do to keep it. Section 10. The peak of the panic, mass trials, and collective madness. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the witch craze was no longer a flickering flame. It was a wildfire. What had begun as isolated accusations had grown into state-sanctioned campaigns. Some of the most horrific and concentrated witch trials in European history took place during this period, driven by mass hysteria, religious dogma, and a legal system hungry for confessions. Let's begin with one of the most infamous episodes, the Würzburg and Bamberg witch trials in the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany. These two cities saw a combined death toll of over 500 people executed over the span of just a few years. Whole families were wiped out. Children as young as 9 or 10 were tortured into confessing and then burned. Clergy, government officials, even people of noble birth were not immune. Once the madness took hold, no one was safe. How does such hysteria gain momentum? The process often followed a chillingly familiar pattern. One or two people, usually women, would be accused. Under torture, they'd be forced to name accomplices. Those people would then be arrested and tortured, naming yet more. A chain reaction would follow, a domino collapse of accusations, each one fueling the next. Often, authorities kept a written list of people who were suspected based on these tortured testimonies. Arrests would then be made in batches, and the interrogations would start all over again. Torture chambers became assembly lines. People were whipped, crushed, stretched on racks, had their limbs dislocated, or were subjected to sleep deprivation. One common method was strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air, then dropped suddenly, dislocating shoulders. The pain was unbearable. Under such conditions, most people would admit to anything just to make it stop. And yet, despite these horrifying methods, the authorities considered the trials fair and legitimate. Why? Because they believed witches were an existential threat. In their minds, Satan was using witches to destroy Christian society from within. If a confession had to be tortured out, it was justified, because this was a spiritual war. But even beyond the pain, the psychology of fear did much of the work. If someone close to you had been executed, you might accuse another just to survive. People turned on neighbors to protect their own children. Some saw an opportunity to settle old grudges. A denied loan, an insult, a dispute over land, all could be reframed as sorcery. A spat over a fence could end in flames. This wasn't unique to Germany. In Scotland, under King James VI, later James I of England, witch hunts were actively encouraged. James himself wrote a book, Daemonology, which outlined the dangers of witches and how to detect them. After a storm nearly sank his ship returning from Denmark, he blamed a coven of witches. The North Berwick trials followed, in which dozens of people were tortured and executed. James's obsession with witches infected the courts and clergy. Trials escalated. Burnings increased. In France, the Les Brouilles witch trials of 1609 claimed hundreds. In Switzerland, the Protestant and Catholic cantons competed in their fervor to cleanse their communities. And in Poland, trials were common into the 18th century. Across Europe, it didn't matter whether the country was Catholic or Protestant. The enemy, witches, was the same. Even more chilling was how judges and inquisitors profited from the trials. Property seized from accused witches often went to the church, local officials, or inquisitors themselves. In some regions, a successful trial, meaning an execution, meant you were rewarded financially. There was a grotesque incentive to find witches. But who were these witches? While the stereotype remained an old, solitary woman, the reality was broader. Men were accused too, especially if they were heretical, rebellious, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Children were executed. Priests who were deemed too lenient were suspected of being in league with Satan. The label witch became elastic. It could be stretched to fit anyone the system needed to punish. And the public spectacle was part of the control. Executions were done openly, sometimes with hundreds watching. The condemned were marched through towns, sometimes gagged or beaten. At the stake, they were often strangled first, if they were lucky, then burned. Others were burned alive, their screams considered proof of Satan's hold on them. Children watched. Priests prayed. The smoke rose. Imagine living in such a world. Every cough, every withered crop, every death in the night could be grounds for suspicion. You would learn to walk carefully, to keep your head down, to avoid being too successful, too different, too outspoken, especially if you were a woman. Because if you had a healing touch or a sharp tongue or a quiet independence, it might be enough to get you killed. And this wasn't some fringe belief, some marginal superstition. The most educated, powerful men of the time believed it. University-trained theologians wrote treatises on the demonic pact. Doctors proved witchcraft through physical examinations, looking for devil's marks or insensible spots on the body. Judges passed sentence based on spectral evidence, visions and dreams. It's easy to look back and feel superior, to think that could never happen now. But the witch hunts weren't the product of ignorance alone. They were driven by fear, by power, by the need for control in a time of instability. And when those forces align, fear, power, uncertainty, any society is vulnerable to madness. The mass trials of the early modern period weren't just about witches. They were about anxiety, identity, religion, and revenge. And they remind us how thin the line is between justice and atrocity when a society is gripped by terror. In the next section, we'll explore the slow unraveling of the panic, how skepticism, science, and brave dissenters began to challenge the witch-hunting machine. Section 11, the role of torture, extracting confessions by any means necessary. By the height of the witch trials in the late medieval and early modern periods, one grim reality became glaringly clear. Confessions were the gold standard of proof. In a world ruled by fear, theology, and the belief in the devil's constant meddling, obtaining a confession of witchcraft became not only desirable but essential. And if it didn't come willingly, well, there were plenty of ways to force it. Torture, in all its brutal forms, was not just permitted, it was institutionalized. Legal systems across Europe codified torture as a method to extract truth. The logic went like this. Witches consorted with demons and evil spirits, which meant they would lie to protect themselves. Only by inflicting pain could the devil's hold be broken and the truth released. The ends, as they believed, justified the means. At the heart of this logic was a terrifying contradiction. People were presumed innocent, technically, but if accused of witchcraft, especially by a neighbor or relative or child, suspicion alone was often enough to warrant arrest. Once arrested, a person might be held in darkness, isolation, and fear for days before questioning even began. And when it did, it wasn't a polite interview. It was a descent into hell. The first step was often psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, cold, hunger, and threats. The accused would be isolated in a dungeon or confined in a stress position. If this didn't break them, physical torture followed. And there was no shortage of tools or imagination. One method was the thumb screw, a simple clamp that slowly crushed the fingers or toes, sometimes breaking bones, often ripping skin. Another was the strappado, where the accused's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope, then suddenly dropped. This dislocated shoulders and caused unimaginable pain. Other forms were even more grotesque. Iron boots filled with boiling water, crushing weights placed on the chest, or the infamous witch's chair, often covered in sharp spikes, where the accused was forced to sit for hours or even days. In Germany and Scotland, pricking was common. Since it was believed that witches had a devil's mark, a place on their skin that did not feel pain, interrogators would stab or slice the skin repeatedly, hoping to find a numb spot. These acts weren't done by madmen. They were conducted by official inquisitors, judges, and town authorities, men who truly believed they were doing God's work. And horrifyingly, they often succeeded. People confessed, not because they were guilty, but because they couldn't take the pain. When you are dangling by your arms with your joints coming apart, your skin flayed open, and your ears filled with screams, you will say anything to make it stop. This is where the madness spiraled. A tortured confession rarely ended with, "Yes, I'm a witch." Under duress, people often gave detailed accounts, names of demons, meetings with the devil, flying through the night, and most tragically, the names of others. Witches never worked alone, inquisitors insisted, and so the tortured would give up neighbors, friends, even their own children. This created a cascade. One name led to another. One trial became 10. A village burned itself from within. And here's the darkest irony. Once a confession was obtained, it was treated as absolute truth. Even if the person later recanted, even if they said, "I only confessed because they tore out my fingernails," it didn't matter. Recanting was seen as proof of the devil's influence. A true confession would be unwavering. So those who tried to tell the truth were dismissed as liars. The trap was total. In many regions, these practices became streamlined. Interrogation manuals circulated, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, which outlined not only how to identify witches, but how to question and break them. These guides encouraged extreme measures and left little room for mercy. They even advised ignoring tears, screams, and claims of innocence, because the devil was a master of deception. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the fact that these tortures were often public. In some towns, people were encouraged to watch. It was a kind of theater, a lesson in obedience and faith. Parents brought children. Priests gave sermons over the screaming. And when the torture ended and the confession was signed, usually with a trembling, broken hand, it became official proof that witches were among them. Of course, all of this was wrapped in bureaucracy. Trials had records. Interrogations were written down. Verdicts were proclaimed with pomp and ritual. It wasn't chaos. It was systematized cruelty, driven by religious fervor and reinforced by fear. And once the confession was given, the punishment began. Execution was the final act, but before that came humiliation. The condemned might be paraded through the streets, forced to wear signs or hoods, jeered at by crowds. In some cases, they were locked in public cages, displayed for days without food or water. Their property was often confiscated by the state or the church, another motive behind accusations. And always, always there were more. Because once one witch was found, surely there were others. Torture didn't just ruin individuals, it destroyed entire communities. To look back on this now is to see the terrifying power of belief. The people administering these horrors were not sadistic monsters. They were believers, ordinary citizens, church leaders, civic officials, trapped in a worldview that saw pain as purification. And that makes it all the more haunting, because it shows how easily fear and faith, once combined, can turn justice into its opposite. In a medieval witch trial, the moment you were accused, your fate was almost sealed, because whether or not you were a witch didn't matter. What mattered was whether you could survive the torture, and most could not. Section H, the gendered blade, why most witches were women. When we picture the witch hunts of medieval Europe, a certain image often comes to mind. A woman, alone, poor or strange, being dragged through a jeering crowd to a grim fate. This image isn't wrong. In fact, roughly 75 to 85% of all accused witches were women. And that imbalance was no accident. It was a symptom of something deeper, something woven into the very fabric of medieval society. To understand why women bore the brunt of the witch hunts, we have to look at how they were seen. In medieval Europe, a woman's value was often defined by her relationship to men, as a daughter, a wife, a mother. Independence was not just discouraged, it was feared. A woman who lived alone, who owned property, who had no husband or children to tame her, was seen as suspicious, unnatural, and sometimes dangerous. That danger was amplified by religion. The Bible, as interpreted by many church fathers, cast women as morally weaker, more easily led into temptation. Remember Eve? In sermons and legal texts, Eve's sin was often cited as the root of all human suffering. Some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, even claimed that women were defective males, less rational, more emotional, and thus more likely to serve the devil. This wasn't just ideology. It had consequences. When a village experienced hardship, whether it was a failed harvest, a stillborn child, or a sudden illness, people looked for causes. And in a world without science, the explanation often came down to human malice. Someone must have cursed us. The question then became, who? The answers followed familiar paths. Was there a woman who didn't attend church regularly? A widow who kept to herself? An herbalist with knowledge passed down from generations? A midwife who lost a child during birth? These women lived on the edge of society, and that edge was razor sharp. Herbalists and midwives were especially at risk. They held knowledge of the body, of birth, of death, of healing, that men did not understand. In some ways, they wielded power. And in a patriarchal society, that power was threatening. When medicine failed, people turned to magic. And when magic turned dark, they blamed the women who practiced it. One example is Walpurga Hausmannen, a midwife in 16th century Germany. She was accused of killing 40 children through sorcery, a charge based on superstition and a few suspicious deaths. Under torture, she confessed to everything the authorities wanted to hear, including flying on a broomstick and sleeping with the devil. She was burned at the stake. And she was not alone. In many regions, entire communities of women were destroyed. In Würzburg, Germany, between 1625 and 1631, nearly 900 people were executed as witches, many of them women, some of them young girls. In Scotland, where witch trials were especially brutal, women were stripped, pricked with needles to find witches' marks, and drowned in rivers to prove their innocence. What made this even more insidious was that women sometimes accused each other. Under pressure or torture, they named neighbors or relatives. Fear spread like wildfire, and trust evaporated. In some villages, entire female lineages were wiped out, with mothers, daughters, and grandmothers executed one after another. The violence was not random, it was systemic. But it wasn't just religious or superstitious, it was deeply political. In times of war, famine, or upheaval, witch hunts became tools for maintaining order. Local lords and judges could reinforce their control by allowing accusations to go unchecked. Women who questioned authority, refused marriage, or claimed inheritance rights became easy targets. Trials became public spectacles where patriarchal power was reasserted through violence. Even legal texts were stacked against women. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer in 1487, argued that women were more likely to practice witchcraft because they were more credulous and more carnal. The book became the manual for witch hunters across Europe. It instructed inquisitors on how to question, torture, and convict women with maximum efficiency. And yet, it wasn't always men accusing women. In some cases, accusations started with female gossip or jealousy, fanned by fear and resentment. A woman who had a healthy child while others miscarried. A wife whose husband looked at another woman. A neighbor who was seen stirring herbs under a full moon. When fear ruled, even sisterhood crumbled. But perhaps the most tragic irony is that many of the women executed as witches were not criminals. They were caregivers. They were the ones who sat beside the sick, who helped with childbirth, who gathered herbs to ease pain. And in return for their compassion and courage, they were tortured and burned. The witch hunts became a mechanism not only of gender control, but of erasing female knowledge. For centuries, women had passed down oral traditions about healing, about childbirth, about spirituality. The hunts disrupted that chain. After generations of silence, much of that wisdom was lost. Today, when we study this history, we cannot separate the witch trials from the broader context of misogyny. It was never just about magic. It was about who was allowed to speak, who was allowed to live without supervision, who was allowed to know. And the legacy remains. Even now, women around the world face violence for claiming autonomy, for being outspoken, unmarried, childless, queer, or simply different. The tools may have changed, the stakes may be metaphorical, but the fire still burns. When we remember the women who died as witches, we don't just honor their suffering. We acknowledge a system that feared their independence more than it feared evil. And we commit ourselves to asking, who are we still silencing today? Because history has a pattern, and if we don't confront it, we risk repeating it. Section 13, Trial by Ordeal, Torture, Confessions, and the Theater of Guilt. By the time a suspected witch was brought to trial in medieval Europe, the outcome was often a foregone conclusion. The judicial system, heavily influenced by religious doctrine and fueled by communal fear, was less concerned with evidence and more obsessed with extracting a confession by any means necessary. What followed wasn't justice, it was theater. A brutal spectacle meant to reaffirm the community's sense of order, punish the scapegoat, and instill fear in those watching. At the heart of many witch trials was the concept of trial by ordeal. This wasn't just a metaphor, it was literally a series of physical tests, often excruciating or humiliating, designed to force the accused to confess or be proven guilty through supernatural signs. One of the most infamous was the ordeal by water. The accused would be tied up, sometimes at the hands and feet, and lowered into a body of water, usually a river or pond. The logic went like this. Water, seen as a pure element, would reject evil. If the accused floated, it was a sign that they were a witch. If they sank, they were innocent, though potentially drowned in the process. It was a lose-lose situation. Survive, and you were damned. Drown, and you were vindicated, but dead. This grotesque ritual wasn't fringe. It was often sanctioned by religious authorities and local lords alike. Other ordeals were more direct. Torture was a common method for extracting confessions. The medieval belief system held that the devil's followers could resist ordinary pain, and thus only extreme measures could unveil the truth. Suspects might be stretched on the rack, their limbs slowly pulled apart. Others were subjected to the strapado, their hands tied behind their backs, then hoisted and dropped repeatedly, dislocating shoulders and shattering joints. Burning, crushing, whipping, these were standard procedures, not exceptional ones. But perhaps most chilling of all was how ritualized these proceedings were. Confessions weren't merely yelled out in pain, they were scripted. Torturers or inquisitors would feed the accused the correct answers, that they had signed a pact with Satan, that they had flown on a broomstick, or that they had killed a child in a Sabbath ritual. People would confess to impossible things simply to make the pain stop. And once a confession was recorded, the trial moved forward with twisted formality. A panel of judges, usually clergy or local nobles, would listen as the accused recited the confession, sometimes forced to do so publicly in front of neighbors and family. Evidence wasn't required. In fact, spectral evidence, claims that someone had seen the accused in a dream or vision, was often admissible. These were accusations that couldn't be proven or disproven, but they carried weight nonetheless. The absurdity of it all extended to physical examinations. Women, especially, were stripped and searched for witches' marks, moles, birthmarks, or other blemishes thought to be places where the devil suckled or left his mark. Midwives or appointed witch prickers would poke these marks with needles. If the accused didn't bleed or react in pain, the mark was seen as supernatural. Of course, this ignored the reality that many of these women were bruised, scarred, or numb from previous abuse. Trials also weren't private. They were public events, often held in town squares or large chambers with crowds gathered to watch. People brought their children. Vendors sold food. In some ways, it resembled a festival, except that the person at the center was being humiliated, tortured, or condemned. And when the sentence came down, almost always guilty, the punishment was meant to make an example. Execution varied by region and time period. Some were hanged, others burned at the stake, a fate made infamous by later witch hunts in Germany and Scotland. Burning was seen not just as punishment, but as purification. It was thought that fire could cleanse the soul and prevent the devil from reclaiming the body. Inquisitors and judges often believed they were doing God's work, even as they set women, men, and even children ablaze. But not everyone accepted this. There were whispers, quiet dissent from a few educated voices who began to question the validity of witch trials. Some scholars, doctors, and clergymen began to argue that many of the accused were mentally ill or suffering from diseases misunderstood by the common folk. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, and hallucinations could explain many of the so-called demonic behaviors. But these voices were few and often silenced themselves. In time, some communities began to regret what they had done. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Families were shattered, villages were traumatized, and worst of all, the seeds of future hysteria were sown. Because the rituals of trial and torture had been institutionalized, embedded into the very legal and cultural systems meant to uphold justice. And so the machinery of witch hunts kept rolling, grinding countless lives beneath its wheels with the silent approval or fearful inaction of the societies they tore apart. Section 4, Children, the Accused, and the Collapse of Reason. One of the darkest and most overlooked elements of the witch hunts in medieval Europe is the way children, those who should have been the most protected, were not only caught up in the frenzy, but often weaponized within it. Their innocence was twisted into something sinister, manipulated by adults or warped by fear, until they became both the tools of accusation and the victims of punishment. It might seem unbelievable, but in some of the most notorious witch trials of the era, children were the main accusers. Why? Because in the eyes of the public, children were seen as pure, incapable of lying. So when a child pointed a finger and claimed, "She made me fly," or "He cursed our cow," it was taken with solemn seriousness. Courts did not question the possibility of suggestion, coercion, or fantasy. Instead, they believed they were hearing divine truth from an untarnished soul. But children were also incredibly vulnerable to the hysteria swirling around them. They witnessed the terror of public accusations, the torture of neighbors, the destruction of families. Many came to understand that parroting the fears of adults could earn them attention, protection, or even revenge against someone they disliked. Some were pressured by parents, clergy, or inquisitors into testifying. Others were too young to grasp the consequences of their words. And then there were those children who stood accused themselves. In places like Würzburg and Bamberg in 17th century Germany, records show that children as young as 7 or 8 years old were put on trial for witchcraft. Their alleged crimes: talking to animals, having strange dreams, playing in the woods alone. Once accused, they were treated like adults, tortured, imprisoned, and even executed. This reveals one of the central horrors of the witch hunt mentality. There was no safety. No one was too innocent, too devout, too young, or too old to be spared. Widows were especially vulnerable because they had no husband to defend them. Healers and midwives, whose knowledge of herbs and childbirth was misunderstood or envied, were prime targets. Foreigners, the disabled, or the mentally ill, anyone who stood out in a rigidly conformist society, were at risk. The madness of accusations often spiraled into bizarre, surreal extremes. People were charged with flying to secret gatherings, transforming into animals, causing hailstorms, or summoning demons by speaking backwards. None of it was possible, yet each confession dragged others down with it. Those tortured into naming accomplices often chose their enemies or simply repeated the names they were fed by inquisitors. In some towns, the frenzy became self-sustaining. Once a few people were convicted, the village began to see every misfortune: a failed harvest, a child's fever, a dead pig, as the result of hidden witchcraft. Suspicion spread like rot. One accusation led to another, until whole families were wiped out. The economy suffered as workers vanished, trust disintegrated. It became a community suicide, each trial cutting deep into the heart of society. And still, the courts persisted. Backed by both civil and religious authority, they believed they were purging evil. Few voices dared to protest. A priest or magistrate who questioned the legitimacy of the trials could be accused of aiding the devil. Fear kept even the wisest silent. Only when the hysteria reached unbearable levels did cracks begin to show. In some areas, nobles or scholars began pushing back. Legal reforms emerged in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, limiting the use of torture and demanding real evidence. Philosophers like Johann Weyer argued that many accused witches were mentally ill, not evil. Others, like Friedrich Spee, condemned the trials in published works, though doing so was dangerous. It's important to realize, however, that the end of the witch hunts did not come from a sudden realization that they were wrong, but rather from a slow grinding down of social resources. The cost of holding trials, feeding prisoners, maintaining jails, and burying the dead eventually outweighed the perceived benefits. People simply couldn't afford to keep killing their neighbors. That, more than morality, was what helped stop the flames. Even then, the fear never fully disappeared. In some places, minor trials continued into the 18th century. The legacy of the hunts left scars that lasted generations. Families torn apart, property seized, reputations destroyed. Communities that once thrived were reduced to hushed whispers and empty homes. What's perhaps most terrifying is how easily it all happened, how quickly reason crumbled, how swiftly neighbors became enemies, how institutions meant to protect the innocent became engines of cruelty, and how ordinary people, driven by fear, ignorance, or a need for control, allowed it all to happen. It's not just a story of the past, it's a warning that when fear overrides empathy and when belief outpaces truth, any society is capable of hunting witches. Section 15, The Last Flame. Lessons from the Ashes of History. The witch hunts of medieval Europe did not end with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow retreat from hysteria as the continent stumbled into the Age of Reason. By the 18th century, the great fires that once lit up village squares and terrified entire regions had mostly burned out. But the ashes they left behind told a story too powerful to ignore. Some of the last major executions for witchcraft occurred in the late 1600s and early 1700s. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, a final infamous burst of hysteria led to the hanging of 19 innocent people, just as Europe was beginning to turn its back on similar madness. In Poland, Hungary, and parts of Scotland, isolated burnings and trials would persist into 18th century. But slowly, the flames dimmed. Not because people stopped believing in witches, but because they began to doubt the process of finding and punishing them. What changed? Science, Enlightenment philosophy, the growing power of secular governments. New ideas emerged that challenged the old order. Thinkers like Voltaire, Spinoza, and Descartes questioned superstition and emphasized rational thought, evidence, and skepticism. Courts began to require proof, not just fear. Torture was outlawed in many places. Religious dogma, while still powerful, no longer had the unchecked legal authority it once wielded. But history never disappears. It lingers. And the story of the witch hunts remains relevant. Not because we still believe in witches, but because the mechanisms of persecution they revealed are still very much alive. Every witch hunt followed a pattern: fear of the unknown, scapegoating of the vulnerable, and institutions reinforcing hysteria under the guise of justice. The targets may change, from women to immigrants, from heretics to political dissidents, but the logic remains hauntingly familiar. We see it in propaganda, in conspiracy theories, in the persecution of those who do not conform. The witch hunts also expose a painful truth about human nature, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when gripped by fear, especially when they believe they are righteous. Most of the torturers and judges were not sadists. They were members of the community, trying to do what they believed was right. That's what makes it so terrifying. Evil does not always come wearing horns. Sometimes it wears robes, holds a Bible, and smiles. And then there are the victims. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, whose names have been forgotten. They died not because of who they were, but because of what others feared they might be. Widows, herbalists, healers, the poor, the outspoken, they were crushed by a system that refused to see their humanity. In recent decades, some nations and communities have begun to reckon with this past. Memorials have been erected. Apologies have been issued. Scholars continue to unearth forgotten records and restore dignity to the dead. But these gestures, while important, cannot undo the trauma. They can only remind us, never again. It is easy to judge the past, to call the people of the 15th or 16th centuries ignorant, savage, or superstitious. But that would be a mistake. The better question to ask is, what would we have done if we were there? Would we have spoken up, or stayed silent, or joined the crowd? Because the witch hunts were not about witches. They were about fear, power, and control. And when those forces take hold, they don't need a broomstick or a pointed hat. They only need silence. So when we study this history, not just as a curiosity, but as a mirror, we must ask, are we any different? Are we better? Or are we still building stakes of our own, just by another name? The last witch may have died centuries ago, but the fire, that fire still flickers, and the lesson it offers is clear. To let fear go unchallenged is to risk becoming the monster we once hunted.